Hey Research Stat 1 class, this is Stephanie and I am coming at you with our first lecture for Chapter 3, all about operational definitions and variables. This is something that is covered in the book, but only very, very briefly. And so I want to make sure that you have a really good, solid foundation in these ideas because they are foundational to research. So if you don't really understand what a variable is, if you don't understand why an operational definition is important, that's going to hold you back. It's going to mean that you're not able to design good correlational investigations, good experiments later down the line. So this is something that we really want to make sure that you understand. So I am using a different book for most of what I'm going to tell you. It's a really fantastic book. And if you can find, sometimes at Half Price Books, they sell the older editions of these books. If you can find the 6th edition of this book, it's usually pretty cheap. It's like $10 or $15. I think it's a fantastic kind of supplement. It's a research methods book by Goodwin and Goodwin, and it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite research methods books that's currently in print. So I think they're on the 7th edition now, which is like $250. But this section is very similar in the 6th edition. So I highly recommend if you're interested in this topic, or even if you just want some additional support for learning, that you go invest in that Goodwin and Goodwin 6th edition. So this goes with our PowerPoint then that's entitled Operational Definitions and Variables. So one of the things that we have to kind of establish early on is that psychology is a science. So we've been talking about that now for the last 2 weeks, right? So if it's a science, we're going to use the scientific method. And if we're going to use the scientific method, then that means that we're going to use scientific investigation, right? The scientific method to test our theories. We're going to create those testable hypotheses, right? So I posted 2 links for you earlier in the week that I hope that you've had a chance to watch now. And the whole idea behind those links was kind of the science of psychology, right? It very briefly, how is it that we use the scientific method? It answered questions like, what are empirical questions, right? So the easiest way to remember what an empirical question is that it is a question that is answerable with data. And so it's answerable, but it's not based on belief. It's based on investigation. Right? Those are the 2 kind of biggest components that you have to know for empirical questions and empirical data. So you guys this week are reading an empirical article, right? You're actually reading 2 articles. You're reading a review article, which is based on lots of different people's empirical findings. And then you're also reading an empirical article. So an empirical article, as the name suggests, means that it's answering questions by finding information, right? It's a data-driven approach. And so it's that you're going to use that scientific method to find the information. So there are, within the idea of scientific investigations, there are a number of terms that I think a lot of people take for granted that you know. Certainly they used to be terms that we were taught in school at relatively young ages, but more and more I encounter students who either have never heard these terms, or they've heard them but they don't really understand what they mean. And so I think it's really important that we talk about these terms and clarify them. So the first is the idea of a construct. So I think about a construct as being like a big idea. So it's the big idea that you want to investigate. So a construct, because it's such a big idea, it cannot be observed itself. We're going to have to find a way to utilize a refined question to answer the big question that we have within the construct. So constructs themselves cannot be directly observed. They cannot be directly measured. again, they're really broad, kind of general constructs. So for example, if we talk about something like depression is a broad construct. And so depression has a lot of facets to it. Different people believe different things about depression, right? So I may have one theory of depression, a different researcher may have a different theory of depression, right? So it's the same construct, but it may be treated very differently by different researchers. So in order to answer that kind of big question that we have, that construct idea, we're going to have to put it into terms that everyone can understand. So they're going to have to be relatively simple. They're going to have to be clear. And so we're going to talk about variables and operational definitions. So first, let's talk about what a variable is. So I just love, this is the definition of a variable that is relatively popular. It's given in a couple of different places. So a variable is defined as a measurement or category that can take on multiple values. So I remember being a student and reading this definition and going, okay, I've read it like 5 times and I still don't know what in the world that means, right? It can take on multiple values. Okay. And so I'm thinking, when you read that, and if you're just taking it really literally, you're probably thinking that a variable is numbers, because numbers can take on multiple values, right? But a variable is anything that can take on multiple values. So if you stop thinking about numbers and you start thinking about kind of maybe more category labels, you can start to see that lots of different things could be variables. So for example, gender, right, can be a variable. Ethnicity could be a variable. These are examples that students often can identify with. But there are a million different ways to think about a variable. So depression could be a variable, and depression becomes a really interesting case of a variable, because we could think about depression as being kind of low, moderate, and high, but we also have pen and paper measures that are going to give us scores for depression. So instead of thinking about someone as just being kind of a category low, a category moderate, a category severe or high, we could think instead about an exact number of depression and what that number might represent and mean. So instead of saying someone has low depression, we might say their score is between a 1 and a 12. Someone has higher depression or moderate depression, their score is between a 13 and a 26. So there might be ways to quantify some of these things that on the face of it may not seem quantifiable. So variables are actually a lot more complex than you might initially think. That complexity then is the reason that it is so important that we define our variables in no uncertain terms. If I tell someone that I'm interested in studying depression, I've told them the construct, but I haven't really told them anything about what I mean when I say depression. So I have to operationally define that variable so that people have no question about what I mean when I say depression. So when I say depression, I might define that as someone's score on the Beck Depression Inventory. But the Beck is not the only inventory we have. So I might define it as someone's score on the Hamilton Depression Inventory. I also might invent an inventory myself, right? So their score on Stephanie's depression inventory. I might send someone off to a clinician and ask them to rate them as low, moderate to severe depressed, to severely depressed. So there are all kinds of ways that I might define depression. And it is my job as a researcher to make sure that you understand exactly what I mean when I say depression. And the way I do that is with that operational definition. So the operational definition is the explicit explanation of a variable in terms of how it is measured or manipulated for a specific study or purpose. And that's right from the Goodwin book. This is actually an incredibly important idea then, this idea of the operational definition. And you and I are going to work with this idea a number of different times this semester. We're going to start pulling apart articles. I'm going to ask you how was this idea operationally defined? How was this idea, what was the big construct? How did they make you understand what they were actually looking at And do you think that was the best way to do it? Do you see any problems with their operational definitions? Did they tell you they were doing one thing and then do something else, right? Operational definitions keep us in line, and we'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes. But first, let's go back to this idea of variables. So we're going to have an operational definition for our variables. So let's talk about what a variable is. So I gave you that bizarre definition that feels insanely unsatisfying, right? And then I give you some examples of what variables are. So when we say it can take on multiple values, remember it doesn't have to be numeric. It could be things like categories. And now all of a sudden that really opens up, what a variable could be. It could literally be anything where you can have kind of two points of comparison. And that idea then that it can take on multiple values or that it has 2 points of comparison is really important. Every semester, I have students who have had me for Research 1, and they're completing their Research 2 projects, and they come to me pretty early in the semester, and they're like, "Hey, Stephanie, you have," and I do have this saying, I really do, once you've had me as your professor, you have me forever. So you're always welcome to come talk to me, and if I have the time to help you with a class that's not one of my classes, I absolutely will do it, and especially for research, because I love this stuff. And so they kind of bounce their ideas off of me, which I love. And every semester I have someone who's like, okay, this is what I'm thinking, but I'm confused, and here's why. And it always has to do with gender. And what they often are doing is they're only looking at males or they're only looking at females as one of their variables. And so I ask them, I'm like, okay, tell me what we learned when we talked about variables. And so we start this conversation, and all of a sudden there's that light bulb moment. And they're like, oh my gosh, there's no comparison. Exactly. If I'm using gender and I'm only looking at males, it's actually it cannot be an experimental variable in my study. It can be a control variable, and that's a special type of variable. But it's not going to be one of the 2 main types of variables that we talk about, which is an independent variable or dependent variable. Those have to take on those multiple levels. So if you want gender as one of your variables, it's absolutely a variable if you use at least 2 levels of gender, right? So male, female, and of course you can use more, right? I think Facebook has like 72 different genders that it recognizes now. So this idea of gender then absolutely can be a variable if you use it properly. And that's true for anything you're interested in studying. It has to take on within your study those multiple levels. So let's talk about those 2 main types of variables that we need to investigate, that we need to study and use in our investigations. So the first one that we're going to talk about is a dependent variable, and the second is the independent variable. I want to just mention really briefly, I put this in the PowerPoint notes, but we are this semester studying correlation, and in correlation there's some debate about whether we should talk about independent and dependent variables, and instead the term we're going to use in this class are predictor variables. Those are very important, and we'll talk when we get to chapter 8 about why we use the term predictor variables instead of independent variables in the correlation example. But when we talk about experiments especially, we are talking about dependent and independent variables. So a dependent variable is a variable that is being measured by the experimenter. So in the dependent variable, we are often collecting, that's the data that we're collecting. So often it's going to be numbers if we're doing a quantitative study. If we're doing a qualitative study, we try to find ways to code that data often numerically. So often the dependent variable, especially in this class, is going to be numeric. Sometimes the dependent variable is known as an outcome variable or also a response variable because it is the response of the participant that you're collecting. One of the unique features of a dependent variable within a study is that you can have multiple separately measured dependent variables. And what that means is this: you might have 10 different dependent variables in a single study that you're measuring at the same time. So a great example of this would be like for a stress study. We could have people providing salivary IgA. We could be taking blood cortisol levels. We could be taking saliva samples for cortisol as well. We could be looking at blood pressure, heart rate. We could be looking at galvanic skin response. We could be doing all those things at the same time to investigate a bunch of different measures of stress. So dependent variables are not kind of relegated to just having one or two. You can have as many really as you want in a study that you're capable of capturing. That said, in a lot of studies, we see just a few dependent variables. It's certainly easier to interpret the data when we do that. So often you're not going to see, a bajillion dependent variables, but could it happen? It could. All right. The second type of variable then is the independent variable. And the independent variable is the one that the experimenter manipulates. So I'm going to tell you guys right now, I was the queen of confusing the dependent and the independent variable when I was a student. I remember very distinctly my first exam in research methods. This was on it, like it will be on yours. And this is a true story. Your professors ask you questions and you know that like one of the answers is supposed to be dependent variable and the other is supposed to be independent variable, but I had them so confused in my brain that I don't remember which one I chose, but we'll just say dependent. I chose the same answer for both. So I chose like dependent for both, knowing that, hey, at least I knew I was going to get one of those right? That's called desperation. But by the second exam, I had it down. This is one of those classes where if you don't choose to learn this material, you're not going to do well. Like starting now, you're not going to do well in this class. You've got to get this information down and you've got to get it in your brain. So one of the ways that I studied this information was a little trick that I actually read in a book. And it said that the independent variable is the variable that's manipulated by the experimenter, and the dependent variable, that data that the experimenter collects, depends on the level of the independent variable that the participant is exposed to. And man, that for whatever reason, that just really made sense to me. So you guys are so fortunate. You live in the time of the internet. So you could actually go in and look up, how to figure out if it's the dependent variable or the independent variable. There are a ton of little tips like that. Find the one that works for you and use that and study it. The earlier on you understand this, the better off you'll be. So that independent variable then is sometimes called a factor. So we're going to use those terms interchangeably in this class, factor and variable. So if someone says they have a two-factor experiment, that means that they have two variables, two independent variables in their experiment. Any independent variable that you use must contain at least two levels. So if we're using gender as a variable, and if we want it to be considered an independent variable, we'll talk a little bit more about, like, is it an appropriate independent variable or not in just a second, because it's actually a special type of independent variable. But if you're going to use gender as an independent variable, as this example, then you've got to have at least those two levels, right? Male and female. You can have more, but you cannot have less. If you have just one level of a variable, it's a control variable. It's not one of your experimental variables. So the independent variable has to have at least two levels, or what we call conditions. So again, I know it gets confusing, but we're going to use those terms interchangeably, conditions and levels. So start to get used to that as well. Study it both ways. All right. If we are talking about experimentation, then the independent variable happens independently of the participant's wishes. What ends up happening with the independent variable is that they are randomly assigned to the different conditions. It happens independent of their wishes. So imagine this. Imagine that I am interested in the idea that comfort helps reading comprehension. So I might want to test this idea of comfort by, that's my construct, right? Comfort. And I need to operationally define it. And I might operationally define it as having two different types of chairs, right? So the seat comfort is what's going to matter. I'm going to go buy one chair from Pottery Barn. They're supposed to have super comfortable chairs, right? And then I'm going to home make a second chair out of spikes and wood, so that it should be uncomfortable, right? That's how, from my experiment, that's how I'm going to define it. So the comfortable chair is the, down cushion chair from the Pottery Barn, and the uncomfortable chair is my homemade wood spike chair. Okay. I have two conditions. And if people came into my study and I said, hey, hi, welcome to my study. Thanks for coming down. I've got two conditions for you. In one, you're going to sit in a fabulous, comfortable chair from the Pottery Barn. But if you'd rather, you can sit on my uncomfortable homemade chair of spikes. What would you prefer? Normal people are going to probably choose the comfortable chair. And this is one reason why it's important to randomly assign participants to conditions. They don't get to choose where they go. It happens independently of their wishes. And in truly random assignment, there should be no rhyme or reason about why certain people go into certain conditions. We'll talk about random assignment more in about a week, but it's an incredibly important concept in our science, not just our science, in any science. Medical science uses random assignment quite a bit. The idea behind random assignment is that if I don't put people into conditions based on a method, based on a pattern, if it's truly random, then if my number is big enough, hopefully my groups are equivalent. And so it solves some of the problem with inequivalent groups or other issues that we'll talk about later when we get into statistics. And you'll talk about more of that also in research too. So I want to give you another example. So in my comfortable chair study, let's say that I'm greeting people at the door, and the first half of the participants who come in, I say, okay, great, you're in room A, which happens to be the comfortable chair condition. And the second half of the people who come in, I say, great, thanks for coming, you're in room B, which happens to be the spiky wood chair. If people in the comfortable chair condition did better, I might not actually be able to say why they did better. Because I want you to think about this. In the real, if we were doing this face-to-face, we'd actually have a breakout session right now. You guys would talk about, what are some of the traits that the people who come first might exhibit versus the people who come last. But think about this, since I can't break you guys up into groups, think about this for just a second. If you want to pause it, pause the video. But so pause it if you want to. And when you're ready to come back, we're going to talk about it, because people who are early probably are a little bit higher in conscientiousness. They're also probably less stressed, right? They set out their lives so that they would be on time. They may not have encountered traffic, or if they did, they had planned their day for that, right? Think about the people then who come in last. So the people who come in late they're probably stressed, right? For whatever reason. Maybe they encountered traffic, they couldn't find parking, they're just running late because they've had other things happen throughout the day. They're probably lower in conscientiousness as a group. And so when you start to think about that, you can see that we kind of have non-equivalent groups going on here. And that is a real issue for us in a scientific investigation. We want our groups to be equivalent. So we randomly assign people to conditions, an incredibly important idea. So if we have a true independent variable, we will randomly assign our participants to the conditions or to the levels, right? Okay. So I want to talk really quickly about another type of variable, and that is the subject variable. It's also sometimes called the organismic variable. I have to tell you guys, when I put this in as a fill in the blank, I always get hilarious things for organismic. Be careful, it's organismic or subject variable. I'll accept either one. So these are special types of independent variable, and what makes them special is that they cannot be randomly assigned. An organismic or subject variable is something that cannot be randomly assigned by the investigator because it is of the person. It is something that they are that you can't change. So if you are, bringing me into your study, I'm a female, I'm 46 years old, I've had 2 children, I have 2 grandkids, I live in San Antonio. These are things about me that you really cannot change. You cannot change them easily, right? At the very least. So organismic or subject variables are those special types of variables that we want to use. And believe it or not, we use a lot of subject variables in psychology. And this is especially important for us in psychology. We want to study things like depression. But think about this. Your level of depression is of you. I can't change that. Now I may be trying to give you a treatment to help you come out of a depression. But when you arrive to my study, you have a certain level of depression, and I cannot randomly assign you to have it different. If I could, I would just bring all depressed people into a study, randomly assign them to not be depressed, and magically they wouldn't be depressed, right? It doesn't work that way. So you can think about abnormal psychology uses organismic variables. Think about personality. Personality is literally studying the person. So everything that we study in personality is by definition an organismic variable. So things like neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience, the temperaments, psychological needs, right? Murray's needs. All of those things are organismic variables. They are things that we want to study, but we cannot study them in a truly in a truly experimental way. So when we use organismic variables, what we often do is we use them in something called a quasi-experiment. So in a quasi-experimental design, we use a truly independent variable, one that we can manipulate and randomly assign people to, in conjunction with a subject variable. And remember, that's one that is of the person. I can't randomly assign you to a level of that variable. You just come in and you have a certain amount of neuroticism. I can't change that. You have a certain amount of extroversion. I can't change that. Okay. So in those quasi-experimental designs, we take a truly manipulated variable and we pair it with a subject variable. So going back to that comfy chair, uncomfy chair example that I was using, if I wanted to, I could create a quasi-experimental design where I have one independent variable that's a true independent variable, the comfort of the chair, right? I'm randomly assigning you to one of those conditions. And I might use a subject variable in conjunction with that. So for example, I might use neuroticism. So is it the case maybe that people who are higher in neuroticism are more impacted by an uncomfortable chair than people who are lower in neuroticism, right? So those are the kind of investigations that we do using subject variables. They are incredibly important to our science because psychology, right? We want to study the individual. We want to study the person and find human universals as well. And so we use a lot of these organismic or subject variables. Another way that we can use these organismic or subject variables is correlation. So if we're going to try to use an experiment, it's going to be a quasi-experiment. If we want to use them in another type of investigation, it could be a correlational investigation. Okay, so one thing we haven't talked about yet is the idea that the dependent variable for the comfy chair study. So I said earlier on that I think that the comfort of the chair may impact your reading comprehension. So again, reading comprehension is that construct, but I have to operationally define it. So I'm going to define that as, X reading comprehension test, whether it's something that I get online that's a validated instrument, or maybe I might even just use something that I create myself, right? But it would be a reading comprehension test, and I would have to define it and be very specific about that in my write-up. All right, so independent variables and subject variables and dependent variables, these are all incredibly important for us. So the next topic that we have in the lecture are variables that maybe are not purposefully a part of our study, but that might exist anyway, and that we have to kind of be aware of that and be careful for that. So the first is the extraneous variable. So it's also sometimes called a confound variable, and I would argue that where the terminology used to be extraneous variable quite a bit, I think it's actually morphed, and I think I probably read the idea of confounds more now than extraneous variables. But an extraneous variable or confound variable is something that you're not necessarily interested in as a researcher, but that is impacting your study. So years ago, I had a friend who was interested in doing some research on attractiveness and rule following. So people tend to follow the instructions, I guess is a better word. People follow the instructions of people of the majority better than they follow the instructions of someone who's considered a minority. And this is really interesting research. And so he was interested in investigating this as well. So he was going to look at origami. It's used quite often in this paradigm. So yeah, you have people give instructions on how to fold origami, and then you go back and you calculate the number of mistakes they made. And it's a well-known paradigm. It's been tested and replicated, and it's a great way to study this phenomenon. But one of the other things we know is that people follow the instructions of an attractive person better than they do an unattractive person. So he was going to have a relatively kind of average looking person be the Caucasian male, right? The majority instruction giver, and an incredibly attractive Hispanic be the minority instruction giver. And when he told me who was going to be doing the two different roles, I immediately was like, okay, attractiveness is a confound here. And I'm trying to help him figure this out without saying, hello, Houston, we have a problem. So he wasn't taking any hints. He ran a pilot study. I was kind of hoping maybe I was wrong. He went to pilot study. He's not finding anything he's supposed to find. And at that point, I had to tell him, I was like, did it occur to you that the Caucasian guy is not really that attractive, but the Hispanic guy is literally one of the best looking men I've ever seen in my life. And we had a group of us, and he asked three of the other girls who were there, he's like, is that true? And they're all like, yeah. Yeah, that's super true. And he needed to change his research, right? Because he needed to control for attractiveness. A lot of times when you're really close to a piece of research, you may not see very well the potential confounds in the research. And I would argue that's exactly what happened here. He was so close to it that he didn't even it never even occurred to him, even though he was aware of the research on attractiveness and rule following. So anyway, it's just a funny thing. And you can see this stuff happen in the real world. I want to mention something about that. It's one reason why, when you look at articles, very rarely are they just by one person, right? It's a research team. And that idea of having a research team is actually really important because it gives you the opportunity to have multiple eyes looking at things and identifying things like confounds that maybe the principal investigator, or what we call the PI, didn't think about before. So that kind of stuff is really important, okay? So we've got to pay attention to those extraneous variables, and as much as we can, account for them in the study or control for them, right? Ideally, what we would be doing is controlling for them. Okay, So we talked already about the idea of operational definitions. Like I said, we're going to be practicing with operational definitions throughout this semester, and you'll have a couple of opportunities here coming up to think about operational definitions in the research article that you found and turned in. I believe it was due Sunday. I think. I know we've had a couple of things due this week, but I believe it was due last Sunday. So that article, one of the things that I want you to be paying attention to, and you should have already read it a couple of times if you haven't read it yet. So I'm always shocked by the number of students who submit an article to me that they didn't read. And it'll be obvious that they didn't read it because it's either so insanely complex that I'm confused by it. Like, I'm like, oh my, did you read this? It's like 45 pages and it's like crazy. Or it's not even an article. I mean, I have students send me like book reviews and things like that, and I know they didn't read it. So if you have not read your article yet, I'm begging you to read it, and it should be read a couple of times by now, really. You've had it for over a week now. That idea of operational definitions should be something that I want you to go back and look at it. Every time you read that article, it should get faster, right? So take a look at that. You know, the biggest issue we have with the operational definition is that variables can be defined in so many ways, like the depression example that I gave you. But let's think about comfort. So we've been talking about like the comfort of a chair, but think about the other kinds of comfort that might impact your reading comprehension. Have you ever been in a classroom that's freezing cold or a classroom that's too hot, right? So temperature is one aspect of comfort that might impact reading comprehension. Things like the lighting, right, could absolutely impact it. If the light is too bright, that can be a really distracting bad thing for you. If the light is perfect, right, it might actually help your reading comprehension. So you can start to think about all of these ideas of comfort and the million ways that we could define that. So that's really, operational definitions are incredibly important for us. And I want you to, like I said, I want you to start paying attention to that, because you will be creating operational definitions for your final project in the class, the survey project. So operational definitions are important because they tell your reader exactly what you're investigating in no uncertain terms. They know exactly what your construct is and how you have chosen to define it for the study. And that helps them interpret the study, that helps them understand the study. And it also keeps you as a researcher on track. I think one of the things that people often forget is that operational definition is one of the first things you do as a researcher. It's one of the first things that you come up with as a researcher. And so when you are taking that first step and you've kind of done your literature review and you are deciding for your study, what is this going to look like? One of the things you do is you create that operational definition. And so from then on, you should be referring back to it. I tutor people sometimes, and usually PhD students. And that's one of the things that I'm constantly reminding them of, because it's easy to get lost in your dissertation. And so I'm always telling them, I'm like, let's go back to the operational definitions. What did you say you were going to investigate? And are you fulfilling that? Because that's the biggest thing your research committee is going to or your dissertation committee is going to be looking at. So operational definitions are incredibly important, not just for the audience, but they help keep you as a researcher in line. And they are especially important, I would argue, when you're an early researcher. So I actually have some of my PhD students print up the page where they kind of operationally define their variables and keep it with them, especially if they're really kind of lost and confused in it and they're really getting mired down. I have them put that in a place where if I ask them, they can just grab it and refresh their memories and remember where they're coming from and why they're doing this and how they're doing this. What was the promise you made when you came up with that operational definition? All right, so converging operations is also something that's important. Your book talks about converging operations. So one of the issues that we have in science, and not just psychology, but in science, but it is a problem in psychology, is the idea that you have the obligation to report your findings. But ideally, we would not just be counting on you and your findings. Other labs, other people would be testing your ideas as well. And we talked a little bit about this in one of the earlier videos. If that's true, we can think about something called converging operations. So converging operations can work a couple of different ways. Your book talks about it, and I'm going to kind of quote the book. This is the understanding increases as studies with different operational definitions converge on the same result. But I want to be clear that that means that it could be studies all in your lab. It could be just you studying the same thing, operationally defining things in slightly different ways and seeing if you continue to find similar results. That's powerful. But it is more powerful if other people in other labs with different participants are finding similar results. So your book talks about converging operations in that kind of general way where we're just looking at different operational definitions. That's important, but it could be doing it in just one lab. Ideally, we'll have those converging operations happening in multiple labs with multiple research teams with people all over the world, right? If we're really looking for human universals. And that idea of converging operations then is an incredibly important idea in science, because if we are finding similar results across different operational definitions with lots of different people doing the studies, that's powerful stuff. That's good evidence, right? We never prove a theory. Never prove a theory. But we support theories. And the more converging operations we have, the more confident we can be that our theory is likely based in, at least to some large extent, on fact or what we might call truth, right? All right, you guys, that's it for today. Make sure that you are working hard on your stuff. And if you have any questions, please email me. I know I've had a couple of meetings with a couple of you on the phone through Zoom, but I'm kind of surprised how few of you have reached out. I'm a little worried about it. So if you need any help, please reach out. Let me help you. I'm here for you. All right. Till next time. Bye, guys.